Now, the lady that we're going to be talking to you about today is a lady called Annie Chapman. Now, Annie Chapman was the second of the canonical 5 victims that were thought to have been murdered by Jack the Ripper. Annie Chapman was born in 1841, and she was the daughter to George Smith and also Ruth Chapman. And in fact, her birth name was Annie Eliza Smith. Now, Ruth and George, they actually got married in a church called St. James's Church, which is in Paddington. And they actually got married on the same month and the same year as Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Annie Chapman had up to 8 brothers and sisters. And in Annie's early teenage years, she actually suffered quite a lot of trauma, as up to 4 siblings of Annie died in an outbreak of scarlet fever and also typhoid fever. Annie's father, George Smith, had enlisted into the 2nd Regiment of the Life Guards in 1834. George Smith served in Windsor and also London as part of the Life Guard. And also, being part of the Life Guard, he had front row seats for King William IV's funeral and also witnessed the birth of the Victorian age when he witnessed the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1837. He was also the Queen's protector against the crowds for Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert. Annie was about 21 years old when her father, George Smith, left the army. Now, she didn't follow her family back to Windsor, but she remained in London. And in 1861, she obtained some work in London. Annie worked as a domestic servant for a guy called Henry William Lure. And he lived on Duke Street in Westminster, and she did this to make funds and provide for her family. Unfortunately for Annie, her father, George Smith, died by committing suicide. The coroners assembled that afternoon and they reached a verdict that he committed suicide by cutting his own throat with a razor, and he did so by labouring under temporary insanity. There was also a suggestion that George started to drink very heavily after he left the army. George Smith's widow, Ruth Chapman, decided to take her family away from Windsor and then bring them back to London, which they then stayed at a place called number 29 Montpellier Place, Knightsbridge. Now, things started to get a little bit better for Annie. In 1969, she married a gentleman who was a coachman called John Chapman. They got married at a church called All Saints Church, which is in Ennismore Gardens in the Kensington area. He was, as I say, he was a coachman and also a relative to her mother. The marriage of John Chapman and also Annie Chapman was witnessed by Annie's sister Emily, along with a gentleman called George White. Now, George White was a gentleman's coachman, and he was the coachman to John Chapman and Annie Chapman for a time that we don't know how long for. In fact, Annie and John lived with George White and his wife for, again, a time not specified. But one thing we do know is that Annie Chapman decided around that time to move back in with her mother in 1870 so she could give birth to her first child, Emily Ruth. Annie's husband, John, got a job as a nobleman, which was just on Bond Street. And he got this just after the birth of his second daughter, Annie Georgina, which she was born in June 1873. Around that time, they were both living, Annie and John, at number 17 South Bruton Mews. That time in Mayfair, there was many stables and coach houses for the great houses and mansions in Mayfair. Sometime in the 1880s, John moved his family back to Windsor. They stayed at a place called St. Leonard's Cottage Farm, in which they stayed within the attics there. This was also the place where Annie gave birth to her last child, who was known as John Alfred. And unfortunately at this time, whilst pregnant, Annie was drinking heavily. In fact, she was seen regularly walking around the streets of Windsor looking like a common tramp. She was often arrested in the area, but there was no reports that she was taken to a magistrate's court. The drinking and the arrests started to get on top of the Chapman family, and in 1882, unfortunately, Annie and John separated. After this divorce, Annie Chapman decided to move back to London. And as she moved back to London, she received an allowance of 10 shillings a week from John Chapman. John Chapman remained in Windsor, and he remained there with his children. In fact, their daughters went to a private tuition school in Windsor, which was actually paid by their auntie. Their son, John Alfred, was said to have been disabled, and he spent a lot of time at the London Hospital in Whitechapel. Now, Annie Chapman's eldest daughter, Emily Ruth, suffered with many epileptic fits. Then she passed away with meningitis, just aged 12 years old, and this happened in 1882. In 1886, John Chapman had to leave his job due to ill health. He moved to another place in Windsor, and unfortunately that year, in 1886, he actually died on Christmas Day. John Chapman died of cirrhosis of the liver, which is a fluid in the peritoneal cavity. He also died of dropsy, which today we call that condition edema. The 10 shillings a week that she was getting from John Chapman stopped, and so she made her way from London back to Windsor where they lived to see what was going on. Residents in the area described a tramp-like woman going in and out of pubs throughout those few days. Annie Georgina said on George Chapman's deathbed that she had been appointed by a French institution. Another thing that she also said was that she joined a performing arts group that was a circus company that travelled the country. But these two myths are said to be myths according to the descendants of the Chapman family. Their son, John Alfred, was said to have been put into a charitable school just outside of Windsor, which in fact Annie went to visit now and then. Annie Chapman had a tragic life. Her father committed suicide, her own siblings died from fever, and even her own children also died through illness. No wonder Annie was an alcoholic. When Annie separated from her husband, in 1886 she moved back to London. Her friend Amelia Palmer said that she resided in many common lodging houses around the Spitalfield and Whitechapel district. Annie Chapman, whilst living in the Spitalfield area, took up a relationship with a guy that made iron sieves, and he went by the name of John Civvy. Now, we don't know whether that was his real name or whether that was his nickname, seeing as he made iron sieves. But when their relationship finished, John Civvy, he decided to move to Notting Hill, which is in West London. After John Civvy, Annie Chapman then formed a relationship with a guy called Edward Stanley. He was 47 years old, and many of the newspapers later on referred to Edward Stanley as the pensioner. Edward Stanley later said that he knew Annie when she lived back in Windsor, and he infrequently stayed with her in Dorset Street, which is in Spitalfield area, known as the worst street in London. In fact, newspapers called it the worst street in London. Amelia Palmer, who was a great friend of Annie Chapman, said they were both in the habit of writing to each other back and forth. She described Annie as a very clean, polite and sober woman, and she very rarely used bad language. Amelia said that Annie didn't really have much of a way of a living, and she would frequently visit the streets, and Annie was described as not being very particular on how she actually earned that money. It was also said by Amelia Palmer that she would often stay out late at night, and the deputy house lodging keeper, who went by the name of Timothy Donovan, said that Annie actually brought back random men to the lodging house. Her friend Amelia Palmer acknowledged Annie liked the taste of rum, and she also acknowledged that she was addicted to drink. But the deputy house lodging keeper, Timothy Donovan, thought otherwise. Annie's friend Amelia Palmer realised that Annie Chapman was getting the taste of rum, and also realised and acknowledged that she was becoming addicted to drink. Although Timothy Donovan, the deputy house lodging keeper, thought otherwise. Mr. Donovan thought that Annie Chapman was a very friendly lady who got along with everyone. He often described her as mostly sober during the week, but on a Saturday she would regularly stay out late and come back quite drunk. Timothy Donovan was said to have been very surprised to hear that Annie Chapman had drunk to excess on the night of her murder. But the truth is, guys, Annie Chapman was a long-term alcoholic. And she was an alcoholic because of the suffering that she endured at a very early age, with her father committing suicide, losing her siblings, losing her children, and then separating from her husband. When she separated from her husband, she was still receiving 10 shillings a week, and this obviously fueled her drinking habits. Just a few weeks before Annie's death, Annie probably didn't realise, but she was actually dying of a disease of the lungs and also to her brain. She also got into a really fierce fight with a fellow lodger called Eliza Cooper, in which she was left battered and bruised. This is where Annie's story ends, and I just want to say thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Jack the Ripper Stories.